Good afternoon. This is Julie Pavlik of Worldwide ERC. Thanks to everybody for standing by, and welcome to our Worldwide ERC Learning Zone entitled How Workforce Mobility Drives Strategic Workforce Management. I would like to thank today's sponsors, Weichert Workforce Mobility. Before we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping announcements. If you're experiencing technical difficulties joining the WebEx session today, please dial 866-779-3239. Email questions may be sent to support@webex.com. Our webinar today is being offered through a broadcast audio stream. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you have a question during the presentation, you may submit it online. To submit your questions, use the Q&A tab located in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Simply click on the tab and type your question into the dialog box at the bottom of the screen, and then click the send button. Please note that we do expect a high volume of questions, and all of them will be answered publicly. Today's webinar is eligible for 1 CRP and 1 GMS credit. If you hold your CRP and or GMS designations and would like to receive credit for this Learning Zone webinar, you must utilize the recertification credit forms, which are available on our website in the Certified Relocation Professional section under Education and Training. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Tim McCarney is the Director of Corporate Communications at Weichert Workforce Mobility. Tim's primary role is developing effective communication strategies to strengthen Weichert's position in the global market and overseeing all of the company's communications to customers, employees, and the media. Utilizing advertising, PR, marketing collateral, client communications, and social media, he furthers Weichert's reputation as an industry knowledge leader. Tim holds a master's degree in professional business writing from Emerson College, holds his SCRP and SGMS designations, and has served on Worldwide ERC's Mobility Editorial Advisory Committee from 2007 to 2011. In recognition of his work to advance the workforce mobility industry, he has been awarded ERC's Meritorious Service Award in 2009 and the Distinguished Service Award in 2011. Joining Tim is Laura Levenson. Laura has spent her entire professional career in global workforce mobility and assignment management consulting with special focus on outsourcing, cost reduction, change management, cross-cultural training, and program implementation. Prior to joining Weichert, she worked for KPMG, Kaplan Education Centers, and TNC, a Berlitz company. She also spent more than a decade in increasingly strategic roles at various third-party relocation management companies. Laura holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania and language certification from the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies and an MBA studies at Pace University's Leuven School of Management. Laura also holds Worldwide ERC's GMST designation. And rounding out our group of presenters is Susan Macchia. Susan is Manager of Global Mobility and Compensation at H.J. Heinz. She has spent 12 years working with international assignees at brands such as Heinz, Chiquita, and Lincoln Electric. Prior to her work with expats, she was an executive financial planner for 9 years with heavy focus on tax, stock planning, retirement, and estate planning. Susan's personal philosophy is she who dies with the most passport stamps wins. With only 15 countries stamped in her passport, she still has a long way to go. I believe Tim is going to start things off, so we are now going to turn the program over to him. Tim?
Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you also to those of you who are listening to our program. I just want to start by providing a framework for the information we'll be sharing with you today. Is anyone who works in workforce mobility either on the corporate side or as a service provider would tell you, the mobile workforce is really becoming increasingly diverse, as are the types of moves that companies are using to achieve their objectives. Now, reflecting these changes, our company actually underwent a change recently, adopting a new name, Weichert Workforce Mobility, which we felt better captured not only the broader scope of relocation and assignment solutions we're providing for an increasingly global workforce, but also the evolution of the way companies view their workforce mobility programs, where they once primarily may have utilized relocation as a means to simply move talent from one point to another. Today's companies really appreciate how workforce mobility not only impacts their recruitment, engagement, and retention efforts, but also, and perhaps most importantly, how it can drive their talent management and global business strategies. To that last point, today's presentation really reflects the perspectives that we have gleaned not only from our day-to-day work helping companies across the world optimize the deployment and management of their mobile employees, but also from consulting with hundreds of clients on how to best align their workforce mobility policies with their business needs and talent management plans, and from the exhaustive proprietary research we've conducted on workforce mobility, from collaborating with organizations like Towers Watson and the Human Capital Institute to develop best practices, for ensuring that workforce mobility drives global business strategy. And lastly, these perspectives are also shaped by the clients, suppliers, and stakeholders such as recruiters or talent management professionals who we work with who are interested in driving more value from workforce mobility. So using that concept that in the most optimal situation, your workforce mobility program should drive your global business strategy as the basis for discussion, we're going to use the next 45 minutes or so to explain how mobility has evolved to continuously support a dynamic workforce strategy, examine best practices for aligning workforce mobility with your business strategy, and with the expert perspective of one of our clients, Heinz, we'll overview a collaborative approach to developing appropriate policies for all demographics to heighten efficiencies, boost speed of deployment, improve employee productivity, and perhaps most importantly, control program costs. And Laura, I'm going to turn to you first and ask you to sort of kick things off by kindly recapping for our audience how workforce mobility has evolved and really how the face of workforce mobility has changed over the past several years.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that great introduction. I just want to acknowledge certainly that for those of us who've been around for at least 15 or 20 years, we can probably remember a time in that first little picture with those ladies with their little diapers on their heads that at one time organizations were very hierarchical. There was usually one place to work, and companies followed a standard set of business hours. From there, the workplace has certainly evolved into a more multinational situation where there's increasing autonomy and flexibility in the organization. There are core work hours still, but there are a growing number of locations, either domestically and or internationally, for a particular organization. There are certainly many organizations that are still in that model, but many of those that are moving towards a state which could be called as an open talent state, where there's a great amount of flexibility in terms of the organizational structure. There's real-time accessibility through the use of technology, and teams are truly global and virtual, operating on a we like to say 24/5, but I think most of us would argue it's a 24/7 schedule. So in reality, there's been a great shift in the workforce dynamics, and based on these workforce dynamics, clients are coming to us and telling us they need people who can embrace the change, and therefore they need assistance, really, with these talent management issues. And that's where we have started and continue to play a big role in terms of the global maturity model. So if Tim, you could go to the next slide. We have this model here that depicts a definition of going global that really is based on where the revenue is generated. So clearly there are other ways to define maturity, but for the purpose of this discussion, we're using the center of revenue generation. And I think at this point, it's early on, but we'd like to get some input from the audience. So Tim, could you help us with a poll determining where on the spectrum our audience would regard themselves?
Well, certainly. Clearly not wasting any time getting the opinions of the audience, but we do very much value the perspectives of our audience and would ask that you participate in a very quick poll. You can see the questions right on the side. And the question we have for you is, as Laura explained, where do you think your company lies on the global mobility maturity continuum? And the choices are, as you can see, domestic or multi-local, going global, or fully global. So we'll give you a couple of seconds, I should say, to complete that and get your answer in. But while they're doing that, Laura, I would like to ask you, in your experience working with companies and helping them define their programs and policies, where would you think most companies, maybe not so much where they think they fit, but where they actually do fit in on the spectrum?
That's a really important distinction you just made there, because there are sometimes there is a challenge that if a company considers itself global, but in fact it's really not quite there. So in our experience, and this is taking into account, that there's been change in more recent years. Certainly, there's been more progression towards the higher end of this chart. But at the end of the day, I would say that it's still the majority of the populations that we deal with are either multi-local or going global. So the revenue is still mostly generated out of the home country where the headquarters reside. There may be more than one business unit, but it's still the majority of the revenue coming out of that one country headquarters. So right in the middle between multi-local and going global is where we see most of our population.
Excellent. Well, we have closed the poll, so we should be generating those responses right now so people can get a look at. And it looks like the majority are registering fully global. That seems to have been the most popular. Fully global with going global and multi-local, very close to those. So very interesting, and thank you all for participating in that. I'll turn it back to Laura now.
Great, thank you. Well, I find it a little bit surprising, but I don't think that Susan will, because when we hear, I don't want to steal Susan's thunder, but arguably Heinz will say that they are in that fully global category. So we'll get back to that when Susan is talking to us. But in the meanwhile, I guess I want to really stress that no matter where your company is on the spectrum, if you're here today listening to this webinar, it's probably because you're experiencing rapid global expansion and need a talent management model if you don't already have one in place. So in today's talk, we're really going to be discussing, Tim, if you just flip over to the next slide, please. We have this pie chart. It's probably still populating. If you could give us one more click. There we go. This pie chart here shows many steps in the talent management cycle, but our focus today is really mostly on the planning phase, which is about understanding what talent you need and where it will come from. Secondly, the attracting stage, which is different. When we talk about talent management in a general sense, it involves many different things. But when we talk about it in terms of global mobility, clearly we mean what does it take to get this person from point A to point B, and to attract the right talent for the position. And finally, we'll be talking about mobility experiences and how they're used to fulfill business needs. And then we'll be talking also about how this deployment works, how we get people on the ground efficiently and up into their roles and performing their roles, and then performing successfully so that we're able to retain those folks. So recently, Heinz presented Weichert with the opportunity to assist in their workforce planning and policy development. So at this point, I'm ready to turn to Susan Macchia to tell us a little about the situation that Heinz was confronted with and what prompted Heinz to seek assistance from Weichert.
Well, thank you, Laura. So, as you all know, you only tend to find things out when you're sitting here at your desk when there's a problem. And you suddenly get the phone call that we have a project, we have a role that is now regional, so it could be from U.S. to Canada, or it could now be UK to now a European scope. And what kind of issues do we actually have when you start crossing borders? So really, it was HR calling saying, I think we have some issues now. How do we handle it? What do we do going forward? So I spent quite a bit of time with our HR executives to walk through all the different kind of pain points that they were having with these particular roles that were crossing borders. So then it kind of blossomed into, well, since I have relationships with the HR around the globe, start to find out, A, how they're handling it, what types of things are they running into, and then also trying to educate my HR partners and kind of the managers as we go along to to, hey, we need to have a conversation with global mobility in the U.S. because there are things that you should be considering for each one of these particular projects and crossing borders. So it's really been, and then we kind of, at the end of those conversations, brought in Weichert to help me actually craft the policy. So that's my quick spiel.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, when Heinz came to us and when other companies faced with similar situations like Heinz come to us with a business need like this, we typically follow a methodology like the one you'll see here. We call it a mobility alignment process. And I think the first thing I want to say about it is it's really a methodology, very simply, to identify a challenge, determine a solution, and the path to getting there. So the model itself is not that complex. The difficult part is execution. So another point I want to make is that although we've depicted this as a linear process, it's not hard and fast. There is some overlap that occurs between the different phases. But basically, the phases that we divide the process into are 5 phases. And just to summarize, because I don't want to sound like I'm reading, the first stage is the audit process, where we do an analysis of the current state. And, you know, to some extent, Susan just presented that for us. So then the next step is the design phase, where we define the future state. And then, based on that future state design, we build, and the building in this case was about policy and a service delivery model that could fill the gaps and meet current and future state requirements that Heinz had. Next, we go into implementation, and there are many important parts to implementation. I would argue that maybe the most critical one is the articulation of roles and responsibilities in the process of implementing. And then ultimately we get to refinement, which is the period in which we seek feedback from the stakeholders and human resource and the folks who are actually engaged in an assignment. And then based on that feedback and analysis of metrics that we set out to measure in the first place, we then refine the future state service delivery model to better serve all of the various needs that we have. So that's a summary of the process. Now we're going to dive in a little deeper and talk about Heinz and how they took on this process with us. So starting with the first phase, Susan, can you tell us a little bit about what happened in the audit phase?
Right. For us, as Laura mentioned earlier, I would consider Heinz under the fully global in the maturity model. We have over 50% of our revenue, which is outside of the United States. So given that and given the push to go to emerging markets, we were finding it difficult for employees to accept an expat assignment. You know, you want people to take these cross-border roles, but you want them to understand what impact it has on either their personal life or their financial life. And then we were really trying to move people into the emerging markets that had that basic kind of Heinz knowledge and that history and all the things we were trying to do. So for us, that was just really trying to make sure that we had the right people in the right places and they understood how it impacts their lives with taking this assignment.
Great. Well, to summarize what Susan just said, we move to the next slide where we talk about best practices. And there can be many different best practices when it comes to this phase. Certainly, analyzing the current state and getting the stakeholder input are key to really understanding what the need is. And I would say that one pitfall that we come across often is companies that jump in and say we need a new policy without really investigating what the current state is and understanding thoroughly what the need is. So as Susan said, by getting that stakeholder input and understanding, who the people were, the talent needed, and the places they needed to go, or in other words, a gap analysis, this is what Susan did in order to really uncover the need. So in the next phase, can you tell us, Susan, about the design aspects?
Right. I think the biggest things for me was to make sure that everybody understood the definition of each type of employee. For me, it was explaining to HR that I wanted to describe an expat or an international assignee that is for a set period of time, that the family accompanies you. You get paid in the host location as well as the home location. All of those things to basically define. So we defined an expat. We defined what a local employee looked like. And that is someone who's on local payroll, drives 15, 20 minutes to work every day and then goes back home at the end of the day. For me, the big one was the commuter extended business traveler policy, which is where we worked with Weichert, which is, your family does not accompany you. You stay, keep your home. You don't change your home country payroll. You don't change your benefits, but you travel regularly as part of your job. So for us, it was define it, and then, okay, so now that I've defined it, what does each one of those look like? And then walk through how we treated each component of policy under each of those definitions. So I guess the other last thing was we did define what a permanent move looked like. So if you happen to have somebody who, was working in Belgium but then commuted to the Netherlands every day, but that was just how they chose to live, that is not considered a commuter. So, we were that specific in giving our definitions.
Great. And that's, I'm glad you mentioned that because that is really very particular to the fact that you have a lot of operations in EMEA, and it is very common for people to live in one country and cross border every single day. Sometimes for U.S.-based folks, it's a little harder to understand. We don't really do that quite as often as you're.
Correct.
Yeah.
Laura, if I could just ask a quick question about the design phase. Just the very concept of design, it sounds like something that would encompass so much and bear very heavily on a company's unique needs. Is there really any kind of set standard for design, or is it something that would have to fluctuate on a case-by-case basis?
That is such a great question, and that's sort of like the point, when Susan just gave that little example about in the case of Heinz, it was important to even define that in some cases, if someone's commuting from, cross-border in Europe, that isn't a commuter policy because that person wouldn't fall under that policy because that's just their lifestyle and it's not an actual assignment situation. So given that every company is different, and depending on locations even, it's very easy to get caught up in thinking, but we're different, but we have this specific situation. I would say that it's good to look big picture, and if you look at the concept of adopting a framework, or in other words, talent segmentation, that enables an organization to assess the value of each assignment, so whether it's for business or career development, each assignment really should fall into a set category, okay? So in the case of Heinz, we talked about this, and in this case, the categories became the following. If you could flip over for me. An assignee had to either be leading a strategic mission, in a role where they were delivering products and services, in a role where they were developing their own skills and competencies or those of another, usually the latter, and then finally a position that involved career development, whether it was company-initiated or a personal initiative. So I would say, to answer your question, it really has to do with looking at big picture purposes and values of an assignment, and that helps to guide what the design then should look like from a big picture standpoint. So moving on through this process, we are now in the building stage. And with this foundation established, so doing the audit and then talking about the design and coming up with these categories for every kind of move, Susan, can you now tell us a little bit more about what happened in the build phase?
I was lucky enough that in just the everyday scope of my job, I have very good relationships with the HR business partners around the world. And I really just tapped into them and said, okay, you guys are dealing with this regionally as well, and I want to make sure that I don't build a policy at world headquarters that no one actually uses. We've all had those in our prior lives where we have a policy that isn't exactly practical. And sat down and said, okay, so what are the pain points? What are the budget things that we need to consider? And kind of what's the approval process for that? Can the business actually give us a reasonable lead time? Because we have tax implications and immigration implications that, as you all know, take time to do. And usually with the speed of business, sometimes we don't always have that luxury, but the sooner you can find out, the better. And then from that actual kind of sit-down meeting to talk to everybody, then we kind of build a policy that actually supported that. And then from that, we went to actually developing what the compensation would look like for each of these commuters.
Great. So to summarize, once again, I asked Susan to join me today because I really felt that Heinz demonstrated greatly best practices here. And so to summarize, the build phase for Heinz followed two very important components, which were policy development and, compensation modeling or strategic compensation modeling, I would say. So in the first part, building a policy that reflected program objectives was their key initiative here. And the important goal which they followed was to support the execution of international projects, to make sure that their employees would be fully productive in their new location or in their, let's say, commuting location as quickly as possible. And then the last two, which are certainly just as important as the others, is providing a consistent framework of benefits that are consistent but also have enough flexibility, just enough flexibility, to take into consideration some personal circumstances so that it would be feasible for people to take such assignments. So that was the first part of the best practices in the build phase. The second part, as I mentioned, is really the compensation strategy and then the model that is built to support that. This webinar isn't really about compensation approach. That could be a much longer subject for another day. But in very broad strokes, the compensation approach really needs to be about aligning talent segmentation and should depend on some very basic principles, which are what is the duration of the assignment? Is it a temporary assignment or a permanent assignment? Certainly project or leadership driving the role is an important aspect to consider. Is this an assignment that's in a accompanied situation or an unaccompanied situation? And last but definitely not least, the compensation model needs to address any compliance issues that may exist.
To me, that was a huge one, right? To try and make sure everyone is tax compliant, immigration compliant. That was just kind of, big on my radar screen.
I can totally understand that. And, if we could all go back in our minds to the picture of the global mobility continuum, if you're in that, just barely going global stage, it's maybe hard to imagine this, but if you're fully global, all the various country pairs that exist mean, some very complex compliance issues to consider, not only from, everybody thinks of tax first, but immigration, tax, and labor law. So it is quite complicated, and certainly not least, even if I mention it last.
Correct.
So moving along, the next phase is the implementation phase. So Susan, if you could tell us a little bit about what what you see as the key components of implementation for you so far.
So for me, obviously, it's been getting management, meaning senior management, not necessarily HR per se, but HR management and management to approve the policy, to understand why we actually crafted the policy, and then all the way down to the little more nuts and bolts where I interface or our team interfaces with the payroll in the home and host locations to understand how we're going to handle that, to coordinate and kick off all the immigration and tax work and cost projections that have to be done in order to let management know that, hey, you have this person now who's doing this regional role, and these are the things that you need to consider while they're actually taking this role. And then really the communication with your stakeholders. So once you actually do this, to get the constant and consistent feedback from the employee and from your HR team and from management. And then, of course, once all of this, you have to coordinate everything with Weichert, who's my partner in all of this, to make sure that they know we have a new policy. How are they going to manage it, and how are they going to administer it, and to just keep them up to date on any changes.
Great. And, of course, we had the advantage this time of writing the policy with you, so we knew what was coming our way.
Exactly.
Yeah, we do have that bias that we like to be involved in the writing of the policy because we know that way whether or not it's actually deliverable. Just a small point.
Small piece, right? Just a small piece.
Right. Okay, well, summarize then about implementation. Clearly Susan gave some very specific examples about coordinating different aspects, and there is definitely a lot to coordinate. There's no doubt about that. And anyone who, minimizes implementation of a policy, I would say, caution to doing that because it's never something to be minimized. Even if you already have a program in place, every time you add in a new program or a new policy, you really should be going through some of that implementation step. So I would also say that probably key in the best practices is the clear identification and articulation of roles and responsibilities. So it's about the line manager communicating with the assignee and the communication that happens with the human resources as well as external service providers. And it's one thing to know what your role and responsibility is, but it's another thing to understand how that interacts and integrates with all the other roles out there. And then, as Susan said, finally, if you do all that and then you fail to communicate to the stakeholders, then you're really missing the boat. So that last piece of communicating the program to the general population, to all of the players that are mentioned above, that's also key to a successful implementation. So, moving on to the next phase in the diagram here, which is the refinement phase. Once you've got the program implemented, I would say that it's very important to also consider the refining stage, which is when you gather the information from all the stakeholders we've discussed, feedback from providers, feedback from the different folks sending people on assignments, those on assignments, and then, of course, analyzing the metrics that you've determined were important to the organization in the first place, and using those two points to inform any refinements that should happen in order to, influence and create an even better future state service delivery model. That's really what, that's what supports a global organization that is confronting an ever-changing global landscape, a global business landscape. So that pretty much sums up, that phase and brings us to.
Actually, if I can just ask a quick question on the refinement stage. I have a quick question for Susan. Would you consider Heinz to be in the refinement stage now?
I would love to say yes, but the answer to that is no. We are in the refined stage for the long-term, short-term international assignment policies for our domestic policy. But for me, the commuter was brand new. And, obviously we had a lot of things going on here over the past 6 months. So, no, I'm not. I guess the long answer would be, short answer would be no. I'm not quite there yet. But hopefully in the next few months.
What's interesting to hear Susan say that, I think she's being a little modest though, because it's actually I think that's true in terms of this particular piece of the program. But in actuality, it was your process, wouldn't you say, of refining everything else that was already in place that led you back to the beginning of Audit auditing and designing and building once again.
No, correct, and that's what we've been doing for the policies now that, only being here a year and a half, if you come in with a fresh set of eyes and you take a look at everything and you talk to your vendors and you figure out, okay, what's working? You talk to your expats. What are, yet again, some of the things we need to be looking at? And so we've made some changes as we've gone along for some of the other policies that are already in place. But it's definitely, you live it and the climate continues to change. So you just make sure that you're adapting accordingly.
Great. Well, I guess if I were to do this again, I might draw this picture a little differently, because maybe it isn't really a linear. Maybe it really should be a circular process, because certainly once you refine, you go back again to the audit phase, as you've done here.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's brought us to today. So I would say that, when all these steps are followed, and adequate resources are devoted to each of these phases, and I think another key point is if your company is willing to go back and forth a little bit. So sometimes you get to build, and then you realize, well, wait a second, you kind of lose track, and you have to say, well, wait a minute, what are we doing again? And it's okay to go back to the beginning and verify. And that's actually quite important to the stakeholder piece, because often you do get to that build and implement phase, and the stakeholders are suddenly saying, why are we doing this again? And then, it's a question of reminding the process to everyone, this is how we got here. And remember when you participated in this conversation.
Right. And I think I was pretty lucky in that we had a global HR meeting, kind of coincidentally, and so I just kind of tagged myself on there to give a speak to the entire group, because I had already spoken to them individually, but having everyone in the same room trading ideas, and I did actually come away with some different things after giving the presentation, and then which translated into me giving Laura, a little different direction on where we wanted to go for some of the policy components. So I was lucky in that respect.
I actually have a question I'd like to ask to Laura. Looking at the processes you've mapped out here on this slide, obviously we hear a great success story here between Weichert and Heinz, but is this model, when you utilize it, how often is it successful? Is it always successful, or there's times when you have to kind of improvise and change it up?
Yeah, it's a good question and deserving of an honest answer. I think I'll start by talking about the pitfalls. The pitfalls that clients tend to fall into, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is jumping right to the need without fully understanding the need. So there's a pressure point. Someone makes noise and says we need something, and then someone like Susan is in the position of turning around and saying, okay, sort of stop the bleeding, here's the answer. And, jumping to the answer or the supposed answer before really fully understanding what the issue is, I think is where people get hung up. So I will say that if a client, if a company really truly follows every one of these steps and has the adequate resources devoted, meaning really takes the time to get the stakeholder input, which requires resources. It requires time from those stakeholders to look at something and present their opinion. And again, if there's a willingness to go back and forth and be flexible and communicate, then we very successfully get through the first three phases: auditing and designing and building. The next possible big pitfall comes with implementation, and that happens, I would say, most often if those roles and responsibilities are not clearly defined. And it's easy to say, okay, well, this person's responsible for this, and that person's responsible for that, and this person does this first, and then I do that, and then somebody else does something else. But it is a discipline but it is really critical to spend the time going through virtually all of the processes involved in the program execution, and actually going through and clarifying who's responsible for what. And it's not fun necessarily, unless you really enjoy process engineering. But it is worth that time and effort.
Who doesn't, honestly?
The time and effort put in up front, articulating those roles and responsibilities, makes such a difference. And the other great part of it is, with the reality of people moving in and out of positions, it then makes it possible if someone unfortunately does leave a position, there isn't a crisis. The next person comes in and knows where to pick up. So it's just sound business sense to have that kind of communication. And then, of course, the refinement stage, if that is a necessary part too, to stay on top of the changing needs that a company faces. So I would say it does work when you really truly follow all the steps.
What a great answer, and your honest perspective is greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Well, now we are at the Q&A portion of our program. We have been fielding questions throughout the program. You can send your questions in using the little chat feature in the right-hand corner of the screen you can see. And actually, we have been seeing a lot of good questions coming in. We encourage you to keep sending them if you have some questions, and while we probably won't be able to get to all of them, maybe we will, but we may not be able to. But we will post the answers to every question that we receive at our blog, which you can find at weichertworkforcemobility.com/blog. That's a lot there, but it's weichertworkforcemobility.com/blog. So you can look at that in a couple of days. In the meantime, just looking at some of the questions that have come in, here's actually a very good question. It's a great question for you, Susan. How did you go about deciding what components to include in your international commuter/EBT policy? This is something that our company is currently struggling with.
Well, for me, it was the first, I guess, and foremost, to make sure you're compliant. So compliance was a big one for me. In tax, in immigration, you don't have the issues if you're a European and you're in Europe from an immigration perspective, but you do if you're suddenly going from Europe to China. I can't get you in to do anything. For me, it was okay, how are we going to actually do housing? And I'm sure I'm probably preaching to the choir on this particular phone call, but it's tax, immigration, housing. What are we going to do about per diems? Or are we going to just do a reimbursement? So literally it was kind of walking through a laundry list of things and then trying to figure out where's the most noise and what are the things that are going to impact our employee from a cash flow perspective. I guess that's my short version.
Excellent. Here's a question. I'll pose it to Laura first, but I think it's actually a good question to ask both of you. But I will start with Laura. How long does it typically take to go through the process of creating and implementing a new policy?
So I'm going to assume that question means this whole thing that we just described, all the phases, yeah?
I think we can assume that.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a really good question, and a lot of it is dependent on I would say a lot of it is dependent on those earlier phases. Back to that point about the stakeholders, you see. So if you go zooming along through those early stages without getting the stakeholder buy-in, let's say, it could go very quickly, because actually writing a policy, like, once Susan and I sat down and talked about what's going in and what's coming out, I mean, that doesn't take me extremely a long time to sit down and craft. The issue then comes up later, though, if those earlier phases weren't followed, that suddenly there's a stopgap because, wait a minute, I didn't agree to that, or I have a different opinion, or so on and so forth. So, it could, I would say it really could go, the fastest I've ever seen from absolute start to finish is probably 3 months. And it can take a whole lot longer, too. It could take up to 6 months, because even if everyone is in agreement, sometimes we get to the end, really ready to implement, and then there's something going on in the business that just causes a delay that's just completely unforeseen. So all the steps have been followed, but there's a much larger situation going on. That really depends on the criticality of the project. So, in the Heinz example, they already had other policies. This is one small piece of the overall program, not likely to be held up for very long. On the other hand, if we're starting from zero and putting in a whole new, HR transformation, there could be a lot of holdups because it's a very big program with a very big impact on a number of people and costs. So I didn't give you a very straight answer there, did I? But it could go anywhere from, I would say, the best case scenario to really do a good job with it, you're looking at 3 months on the low end, and it easily can go 6, 7, 8 months without a flinch.
Excellent. That's a great answer. Susan, anything you might want to add to that from Heinz's perspective?
I think for us, for me, I spent probably the most time having conversations with the stakeholders. As Laura mentioned, the policy building itself, I would say, took us, maybe a month and a half. And as she mentioned, sometimes the business needs outweigh me trying to implement a new policy. So that did actually happen in my case, where I've had a policy that I wanted to present since probably late June, early July. And only now am I actually getting to resurface the need to actually put this in formal place and implement and actually start using it. So that's been, now, probably 9 or 10 months. So I think that's a very accurate, from the very beginning. So I think it's a pretty accurate assessment. I mean, the policy creation itself I thought was pretty short and fairly painless. It was more the trying to gather everything from your colleagues around the world and what they would like to see and what's feasible and what's practical.
Here's another question. I think it's a great one for you, Susan. How did you get the buy-in from stakeholder buy-in? I'll assume what the person asking this question means is what steps did you take to gain support within your organization?
Well, when they already called with the problem, I knew if I could come up with a solution, they would be supportive. Of course, they'd want to tweak it, right? They'd want to tweak it, which is perfectly fine. And, obviously you do have certain issues and different things if you're moving people from one region to another. I mean, there's just certain things that you don't take into account where if you have colleagues in Asia Pacific, it's not as common for them to have a credit card or some sort of corporate card, which then impacts how you're going to get them to Europe and pay for a hotel. I mean, sometimes it's that specific that some of the strange things that you face. So for me, it was more making sure that everyone understood and to really talk through, because yet again, here I am sitting here at corporate headquarters, and I have my corporate American Amex, but so it doesn't even occur to me that someone else might not have a credit card, and this is money out of their own pocket. So then you have to figure out how to get them the per diem and all of those things. So it's pretty specific.
That's a great answer. Here's a question, Laura. I'll ask this one of you, and you could probably do an entire webinar on this topic alone, but to see if we can hit upon some of the specifics. It actually mentions the policy, Heinz's policy, but maybe we'll step back and just take it from the consulting standpoint. But does the policy contain information regarding sending employees into high-risk areas? How does the company keep employees safe on assignment? I don't know if, Laura, you have any perspectives or suggestions on that topic.
Yeah, that's a great one. It is very typical for any policy to include something about safety and security, and it depends, this one is a tricky one because some companies don't consider safety and security part of the jurisdiction of global mobility. Sometimes it just falls in safety and security in general, and so when that happens, we may make reference to it in the policy saying, first, you will have a security briefing, and that will be conducted by the security group. You know what I'm saying? So it depends, but it's almost always mentioned. And when I go through a checklist, sort of like a mental checklist of the various components to be considered for any policy, that's certainly one of the ones that's on the list. It depends on the structure of the policy, you see. So sometimes a company will have like a core policy that guides every individual regardless of short-term, long-term, extended business traveler, and that information might only reside in the sort of the core guidelines, whereas the extended business traveler or commuter or rotation may not have that specific reference to security because this particular policy may just be an addendum. So there's lots of different ways to handle it, but security specifically is definitely a very important question in today's world, regardless of the length or type of assignment.
Well, if I could interject from a Heinz perspective, it is not handled in my particular group, but we do actually talk about it. We have a separate group that manages that, so it's really just to get the employee in touch with that particular group, but it's not something that's actually run through specifically my group here.
Yeah. I see that more and more, by the way, that security is just completely separate entity, separate function.
Well, and for me, it's also that has a lot to do with just travel in general. So that is more broad than just global mobility. For me, that's if you have just employees traveling to certain locations, and if you have things that occur, like, God forbid, we had the Boston Marathon to try and find out, what employees did you actually have traveling? Did you have anyone in that town? So to me, that's a much broader scope. But yes, it is mentioned. It's just not run out of our group.
It looks like we'll probably have time for, we'll fit one more question in here. This question is, what are best practices for conducting cost projections for various types of assignments?
That's a good one.
For me, I have to say, I say, hey, Weichert, could you do that for me? So, but really, it's, we kind of have standards on certain policies. So they're following our policy to actually create the cost projection, if that makes sense. So, I mean, they're following our guidelines, our policy to create. I don't know if they were looking for a more specific answer than that. I wish I had a nice... Thankfully, I don't have to do those anymore. Those took a long time. That took a long time.
I'll jump in and say that's really the only way we can answer that question because cost projection for Heinz, long-term assignment, is going to look different from a cost projection for ABC Company for a short-term assignment. So
exactly.
What the program benefits are. If you come to us and say, we don't know, we have no idea, we're at the very beginning, we don't even have a policy, and you ask for a cost projection, we can do it, but we would then need to really talk to you and again say, I would go through sort of a question and answer of, okay, will you be including this? Will you be providing X, Y, Z benefits? And then based on that, I can then do a cost projection. It won't be as thorough as one where we have all the very specific information of the actual individual who's going in an actual policy document and an actual offer letter. So it's a little bit difficult to answer that question.
Well, I think my favorite answer sitting in this seat is always, it depends. And everyone starts to laugh now because I literally say that. You know what I'm going to say. And it's like, well, how much is that going to cost? Well, it depends. Because everything depends on your home and host country combinations, on what their citizenship is. I mean, there are so many variables that now it's become kind of the joke is that, Susan's going to answer that with, it depends. And it's true every single time. Unfortunately, you've heard Laura say it quite a few times.
I feel so much better now that you said it.
Well, some excellent insight and excellent answers. Thank you very much. And with that, we'll turn things back to Julie.
Thank you, Tim. That was a great presentation with lots of good questions from our audience as well. Tim, would you mind, because I've gotten a couple of questions about getting a copy of the presentation, so would you mind reviewing that information again?
Certainly, not a problem. We are happy to take any request. If you send your request to solutions@weichertwm.com, we'll be happy to get something out to you. Again, that is Weichert, solutions@weichertwm.com, and we'll get that right out to you.
Perfect. Okay, again, thanks, guys. That was a great webinar, a great presentation. You could tell by the amount of interest we had coming in from our audience. So with that, I'd also like to thank Weichert Workforce Mobility for sponsoring today's webinar. Just a quick reminder to always keep an eye out on our Learning Zone website because we are constantly adding new webinars. So with that said, I hope you have enjoyed the presentation. I've certainly enjoyed listening to it, and I think that takes care of our webinar for the day. So thank you very much for being a great audience. Thank you for being great speakers. We may all disconnect. Bye-bye.
Thank you.